My name is Kochua. I'm a member of Team Aretuza. I've been playing Gwent since about October of last year, so I missed closed beta. But then after that, I came over from Hearthstone, really loved the game, and I've been playing it ever since. The place where people might have seen me on TV was at the Wild Hunt 2 tournaments, the LAN in Philadelphia, about 2 months ago at this point. Wow, time flies. Which I was lucky enough to compete in and end up winning. And so I will let my partner in crime introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm Gnurrgard from CCG, and I've been in tournament preparation since, I think, what was my first tournament? Wild Hunt 1, exactly. That was still back with Top Deck, and then I made my way up to the head of the competitive section on Top Deck, and I'm doing the same thing with CCG. I've basically prepped every tournament since then.
So you want to go ahead and go through the overview of what we're going to do for today's workshop?
Yeah, sure. First of all, we will talk about just general steps, like step by step, what do you want to do if you prep for a tournament? And that's the biggest chunk of this workshop. And then we'll take some questions from you just to see if everyone got everything we said. And then we'll try to construct an example lineup for the upcoming Lodge tournament, just to show an example of how we could work there. And also with a bit of the different rule set, the Lodge tournament is a bit interesting in that regard. And yeah, and then we'll take some more questions, and then we're just done here. All right, so let's go into the steps of tournament preparation. So what I've noted down as step 0 is find good people to work with. You can do it on your own if you're tailbot, but even he has people to work with, I'm pretty sure. And yeah, it's just good to have people to talk over things with, to practice against, because if you're taking your decks on ladder, people will see what you're playing, and also you're not in a controlled environment, you're not as efficient with your training. So yeah, find some people you want to work with, and then you can go to the next step, which Kochua will talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, once you've got your team or your friends or someone to help you out, you know, when we sat down to think about it, we really thought that there were probably steps that you can go through, and everyone will go through them kind of differently. But you know, there's sort of 4 individual places to sort of take as checkpoints on your preparation for a tournament. And so I'll take steps 1 and 3 and talk about them a bit, and then I'll hand off to Gnurrgard for steps 2 and 4. So what's step number 1? You've got a tournament coming up. You know, you're ready to participate in it. So what's the first thing to do? What I'd say the first thing to do is, you know, gather information. That's the first step. Before you sit down, before you start picking decks, before you start strategizing on how to counter the opponent, you really have to know, you know, what it is that's out there, right? And so it's good to gather as much information as you can before you move on to the next thing. You know, anything can happen in a tournament. There's no guarantee that you'll look at a meta report or talk to your friends and the decks you'll see in the tournament will be exactly the same as what you prepared for. But the more preparation you do, the better your planning is likely to go. So what are we trying to know? Well, I think there's 2 things, right? So the first is, you know, what decks are actually good out there? That's a pretty important thing. But there's maybe even something that's more important than that, which is the second thing we're trying to find out. You know, what decks are people playing a lot of? What decks are popular? Because you would think that it's the same thing, right? People play only the good decks. But you know, maybe it's not necessarily always the case that the decks that people play the most of are the best decks. Particularly in a tournament setting. So if we want to go about finding this out, you know, what sources can we use, right? What's our data gathering tools in this first step? Well, I can think of 3 different ways to go about it, right? One is personal experience. In theory, all of us are Gwent players, right? We play on the ladder, whether that's the pro ladder or the ranked ladder. You know, we know what kind of decks that we like to play. We know what kind of decks that people seem to be playing against us. You know, if we've gotten some good people to work with in step 0, then we can reach out to them and ask them the same thing. Hey, what are you seeing on the ladder, right? What decks have you been finding success with? right? So there's some obvious pros to this, right? Personal experience is sort of really important. There's almost no experience like seeing something firsthand. But on the other side of that, of course, what's the problem with personal experience? Well, even if you play all day, every day, you might only see a small part of ladder around your MMR. Or maybe you just haven't really played enough games you just keep running into one deck over and over again by chance, and you haven't seen a broader part of it. So we can start with personal experience to gather data, but then we should really consider maybe two other things as well. One of them, which is near and dear to my heart, is stats, right? Stats stats are like the opposite of our small focused personal experience, right? Stats are very impersonal, very broad, and they cover, a much broader sample size than what you could see on your own. So where can you find stats? GwentUp has, for example, in their meta reports, an enormous database of useful statistics. You can get win rates of decks there to see what's strong. You can get play rates to see what people think is good and what they're playing. And as you go further on to your process later, when we start talking about strategizing, you can use stats to try to figure out, what leaders is my leader good against, or what are the card win rates for the leader that I'm thinking about if I want to make some tech choices. So stats are a good place to look. But stats are not the be-all, end-all, right? They can never really tell the whole story. And they may be relevant in total, but they may not necessarily be quite as relevant for the particular lineup you're looking to build. So it's important to combine stats with personal experience and not favor, not only look at one versus the other. There's maybe a third thing too that we could use to gather data, and I'll call this one expert opinion. So it's particularly at the more advanced levels of tournament preparation, which may or may not be what you're trying to do, but especially at the advanced levels, tournament experience can be a lot different than the ladder experience. Different decks, there's sort of a different format with fixed coin flips. So I would say that sometimes paying attention to expert opinion specific to tournaments can pay off in some of your strategizing down the road. So what are ways that you can do this? Well, one of the things that you can do is you can call up some of the most recent tournaments that are broadcast. The Red Dragon and Wild Hunt lands were broadcast on Twitch, and obviously so are all of the Gwent Open and Challenger Series tournaments. You can go look at the VODs there and see what some of the best players think are good decks to bring, particularly on a red coin or a blue coin. It may not be quite the same meta in the Gwent Open as it is in the Lodge tournament, or whatever tournament you're participating in. But if you're looking for input from the best of the best, it's not a bad place to go. Look at the lineups they have, look at the cards they picked, and look at how they played their decks there. So we've got three sources now to collect data: our personal experience on the ladder, whatever stats we can find to get a slightly broader look, and then expert opinions like the Open Challenger VODs, or even the Team Aretuza and CCG meta snapshots, which is another way of seeing what the best players think are the current best decks in the meta. So we've done that. We've collected all the data that we have, and now we're ready to start putting that data to use and move on to step 2, which I'll hand over to my co-leader here.
Yeah, so step 2, now that you all got all your data and you got a rough overview of what the meta is right now, you want to go ahead and construct your lineup and pick a theme. Like, you want your lineup is a tool. You want it to do something. You don't want it to be all over the place. So first of all, you have to look, what decks do you have? This is just, if you're not a high-level competitive player and you don't have all the cards, you want to see what decks can you actually build. So just make a quick overview of that. Of course, if you have all the cards like some people do, then you don't need this step. Next up, what decks can you actually pilot well? So there may be a lineup that does really well, like theoretically, but let's say it has X-Men in it. This is a pretty common thing. X-Men is a deck that works sometimes really well, but not every player can pilot it very well. So maybe you want to step away from X-Men then if you don't pilot it that well. Coleman said it's always better to just bring decks you're good with. But sometimes if you've got enough time until the tournament happens, you can maybe pick up the deck and learn it in that time. But I would say like a week before the tournament, probably not a good idea to start a new deck. So yeah, and then the next step is what decks are actually strong. Just sort out you have a list of decks you can play and you can make, and then you want to sort them by how good they are, just in your head, like. And then we go over to the 3 possible kind of lineups you can do. First of all, pretty simple. Just bring good decks, bring good stuff. It's a common strategy. It's kind of safe because those decks are good for a reason. If you're going to bring great swords, it's a good deck. You're going to win games with it. They're good against the field because otherwise they wouldn't be up in the tier lists. And they're also vulnerable to good targeting because people expect the best decks to be brought. So be careful about that. Yeah, so bringing good stuff, in my opinion, is a good strategy if you consider yourself a better player than most of the competition. Generally, I always say if you're better than your opponent, you want to be safe. And if you think you're not as good as your opponent, or it's equal skill level, you have to take some more risks. But yeah, good stuff. If you're better than most of the competition, it's not the worst idea. Next up, we have hard targeting. Sometimes there is a deck that you know your opponent is going to bring, and then it may be a good idea to bring a lineup that hard targets it. What does hard target mean? All your decks have extremely high win rate because it exploits a weakness of that targeted deck. For example, Super JJ, when he won the Grand Open, that was just around the time when there was a huge uprise in consume monsters, the greedy variant. And so what Super JJ did is bring 4 decks that were packed with compressions and muzzles, and he succeeded winning the tournament just because he auto-won every game against consume. Now, this strategy is risky because if you want to hard target, like have a almost auto-win against the deck, you have to significantly weaken your deck against the field because it's so packed full with techs. So if you don't hit the target, it becomes kind of hard to win. So, for example, there was another tournament, also Super JJ, I don't know if you people remember, where he targeted Mill and he didn't run into Mill. So that was a really hard tournament for him and he didn't win it. Fun side note, if he was on the other bracket of this said tournament, he would have run into like 3 mills in a row, I think, and probably would have won the tournament. So kind of risky, but sometimes pays off. Yeah, with the 40 card decks. Yeah, last step for hard targeting, make sure that the deck you want to target is actually hard targetable. For example, if you saw the last Open, House of Cards wanted to hard target Greatswords, and he lost to Hannah-chan, who brought Greatswords. So, in my opinion, Greatsword is not a deck that you can reliably hard target, and yeah, just make sure that you're picking the right deck. Consume, on the other hand, very easily hard targetable because it's so reliant on the neckers. All right, and last but not least, we have soft targeting. Soft targeting is arguably the most successful strategy we've had until now in Gwent's tournament history. It's kind of a mixture of the last 2 strategies, like bringing good stuff, but also hard targeting. So what you do is you bring good decks, but you skew them a little bit towards certain matchups. So you either have 1 or 2 techs for that certain matchup, or you just bring decks that naturally have a good matchup against the deck. The advantage of that is you have a better win rate against the field as opposed to hard targeting, because you're still bringing good decks, right? Even if the opponent doesn't bring, say, great swords, you still have a very good chance to win. And sometimes you find a lineup that soft targets more than one deck. That's pretty rare, but if you happen to do that, this can be extremely good. If I remember correctly, when Tailbot won his challenger, he targeted 2 decks at once. And he won. When he won his Open, he had a lineup that was really good against Henselt and Swords, both decks that were extremely popular at the time. To successfully do this strategy, it's crucial to have good matchup data from step 1. Because if the matchup data is wrong, you're going to end up with a lineup with a weak link, because that deck is actually not good against the deck you're soft targeting. All right, and now after we constructed a lineup that wants to do a certain thing, I'll hand it over to my partner to go to step 3.
Certainly, thanks. And I'll pick it up from here. So now at this stage, you've identified what it is you want to do with your lineup, and you've picked a set of decks that you think are likely to accomplish that goal. So at this point, I think a lot of players say, I've got my lineup, I'm going to bring the strongest decks, or I'm going to counter consume, and they say, let's go, time to play in the tournament. And before we even go that far, I think there's some other important steps. First being, you want to take a step back and look at your lineup. You picked your 3 or 4 decks, you hold them up, and you say, let's look at what I've put together here. We know what the decks are trying to accomplish or how we think they'll win, but we might also want to ask, how could our decks lose, right? What are the weaknesses of the lineup that we put together? Right? Have we gotten so far on a one track of I want to counter something, or I want to have a particular game plan, that it really opens us up to potentially losing to something else that we might be likely to see in the tournament? So I think there's a couple of questions that we could ask here. The first and most obvious one is, could we be hard targeted? If we've brought decks that could all lose to a particular type of strategy, we have to ask ourselves, how likely is it that we'll see that strategy in the tournament? If we think that no one will bring it, then we may be safe. But if we think that it's possible that consume can get countered, then we may want to look at our lineup and say, can consume, if we're bringing it, get a win here? Is this something that we're willing to take a risk? You may look at it and say yes, or you may look at it and say this is way too risky. We may also want to look at, now that all tournaments are fixed coin, and we know we'll be playing sometimes on red and sometimes on blue, we need to look at our lineup and say, do we have decks that we're comfortable playing on both red coin and blue coin? Because if not, if we have only all decks that are good on red coin, for instance, then we may really struggle for the times we have to play on blue to get some important wins. A lot of times I'll make this point and people will then ask me, all right, fine, so I need to make sure that I have decks I can play on red and blue. What is a blue coin deck exactly? Because pretty much everyone will generally win more often on red with decks than they will when they play those same decks on blue. So what is a blue deck? Because pretty much everything is at least a little bit better on red. An interesting question. Sometimes it's very matchup dependent, but there are, I would say, some general things that make a deck at least relatively better to play on blue than certain other decks. I'll throw out a couple things here. If anyone in the voice chat companion wants to type in a couple other things to supplement that, be happy to get a discussion going. So what are things that, to me, make a deck either worse or better to play on blue? Well, I generally tend to think the first thing is, does the deck even run a spy? There are some decks in the meta right now that are pretty strong decks, but they don't frequently run a spy. It used to be that consume was like this until people started putting a spy back into consume. Most full fist lists are also like this because NR does not have good spy tutors, and the only quote-unquote spy tutor they have, DJ, is not necessarily something you want to be using to play a spy in round 3. So oftentimes, notably full fist lists go without a spy. In general, in my opinion, this makes these decks much more vulnerable on blue because they have the opportunity of being spy abused by strong red coin decks. In round 1, a red coin deck can throw out a spy, and all of a sudden, right off the bat, the blue coin deck in round 1 has to decide, do I want to go down 2 cards and give them a pass opportunity, or do I want to get out of the round and give them control over the matchup? So not running a spy, in my eyes, is usually a good reason to not want to play a deck on blue. What's another reason that a deck might not be good on blue? Decks that have slow tempo to open up around, most notably decks that have to set up a lot of engines, are often better off played on red. And why is that? It's because, as we all know, when you're playing on blue, the impetus is on you to open up with high tempo. If you can't always stay ahead of where the red player is, then they get a really beneficial pass opportunity. So when I'm looking at decks, if I see a deck that looks very strong, particularly in long rounds, but starts off slowly, that's a deck that I'm more likely to go ahead and play on red than on blue for that very reason. And sort of vice versa. If there's a deck that has a pretty good tempo opener, that can be a good sort of red abuse deck, if you will. But in my opinion, that's also one that I would consider playing on blue because it buys you a little bit of breathing space to develop your game plan. There's a bunch of other considerations. If anyone wants to throw it out in the chat, happy to discuss them. But those are some first considerations. If you're looking at a deck and saying, what things might I be willing to play on blue? What doesn't seem to be coin dependent as much might be a good place to start. So we've talked about a couple of different reasons that we might step back and look at our lineup. Could we be targeted? Do we have decks that we can play on both coins? And we may find out that there are some weaknesses that we want to address in our lineup. And so this is a good point to tweak the lineup, right? We can tweak it in two different ways. We could tweak cards in the lineup. We could maybe change our tech cards up to make our decks a little bit better on a certain coin or against a certain type of matchup. One example for this is the inclusion in Consume, for example, of cards like Summoning Circle. Summoning Circle is a great tool in Consume if you play against people that would plan to Mandrake your Necker. Well, at least at a certain level. If you get to a high enough level, people are pretty smart and play around Summoning Circle. But if you can find a tech like Summoning Circle that sort of helps protect your game plan from counters, unless people very consciously play around it, then it can be something that helps you guard against hard targets. So when you're tweaking your lineup, you have to take these things in mind, but there's something else to keep in mind too. You're never going to be able to make your lineup good against everything in a balanced game. When I was putting together my deck list for Wild Hunt 2, I was going around in circles a little bit. I would put together a lineup. I would say, oh, this lineup might get countered if my opponent brings these particular decks. And so I would change some things. And I would be better against that one matchup, but then I'd be worse against a bunch of other things. And if you're playing in a good tournament or in a good meta, that's what you'll find. If you make your deck stronger against some matchups, you're likely to make it weaker against other ones. There's almost never a perfect lineup, an optimal lineup for every situation. So when I say go back and tweak and find your weaknesses, eventually you just have to say, look, I made this lineup as strong as I could. Yes, if my opponent brings the perfect lineup, it might be very difficult to win. But I think, based on what I expect to see at this tournament, that I've got a pretty well-balanced lineup that should help carry me through. And we're done with the review and the revision part of looking at our lineup. So at this point, we've picked a theme, we've built a lineup, we've sort of poked at it from the outside to see if there's changes that we want to make, and we're ready to start testing it. And so I'll hand it over for the last step 4, the preparation process, to my partner.
Yeah, so the last step is practicing your lineup. If you made the step 0, finding good teammates to work with, if you did your homework there, then this will be very pleasant. I can speak from experience here. So the first thing is you have to practice efficiently. So just practice scenarios that you expect to encounter. For example, you bring Henselt as your red coin deck. Doesn't really make sense to practice Henselt on blue extensively then, right? Like sometimes you are put in a situation where you have to do it, but most of the time you're going to play it on red, so you don't have to practice it on blue because that's not a scenario that will be common in the tournament. Also matchups. If you say, okay, my opponent is nobody's going to bring full test on blue, then don't practice with full test on blue from your opponent's side. Second thing, practice seriously. So try to simulate the tournament environment as best as you can. So that means if there are not trackers allowed, don't use a tracker during practice. Don't co-op with others because there won't be someone whispering in your ear during the tournament. And concentrate on the game. Don't tab out and do other stuff. Focus on the game, don't autopilot. Then after every game, try to sit down with your scrim partner to talk over the game, what went right, what went wrong. how do you want to adapt the game plan in that matchup. It's good to make notes there during the game, like if there's a scenario where you're unsure how to approach the with what the right plays, how to approach the matchup there, write it down, talk it over after the game. And yeah, speaking of lines, make sure you try some different lines in a matchup. Don't do the same thing over and over in a matchup when it's not working. Try to explore some other stuff to figure out a matchup if you're not confident in it. And that's it for practicing. And now we'll go to questions first.
Yeah, let's take some general questions. Yeah. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to put an outline in chat of everything we just talked about. So there we go, steps 0 through 4 or so. I took some notes as we were going. And so there's a first look through at the theory behind putting together a lineup for a tournament. And so I want to open it up. Everyone can unmute and ask questions or do chat for a few minutes. And then after we're done with that, we're going to go on and we're going to try to do a case study where we go through these steps and see if we can build a sample lineup for the upcoming launch tournament. All right. Any questions? If no one has questions, I'm going to ask one. So last chance before I start asking myself questions. First question, and I'm going to ask this for the two of us to answer, I guess. So we are now in a meta that's been relatively stable for at least a couple months now because there haven't been any updates. And we've seen some interesting shifts, I think, in the meta and what decks are being brought to tournaments. The decks that were being brought recently to things like the Challenger Qualifier weren't necessarily exactly the same decks as what were being played a couple months ago. For example, I brought hand buff, Gnurrgard hand buff to Wild Hunt, and it was a really successful deck for me. It won almost every game, often by 20 or 30 points. But very recently, we saw hand buff sort of fall out of the tournament meta. So I'll throw this question out and give my thoughts after I get some other answers. So what do you think sort of is driving those changes? And what do you think is a good lineup in this current meta for a basic Conquest tournament? Anyone have thoughts on that? Gnurrgard to answer that one, since he's my partner in this one.
Yeah, it's always like from what I've experienced, it's just Dogma wants to ask a question, or no, they're just trolling. Okay, from what I've experienced is that we always have to look at first of all pro ladder and what people are playing there, and then the last tournament. So it's always weird to bring the same strategy that you brought last tournament because you already brought it. So people might expect you to do the same thing, but then again, maybe they think you're doing the same thing, and it's kind of a mind game going on there. And then, of course, new decks are being invented or just thrown out there, like the Foltest deck or Shoop very early on. That's also a reason why hand buff disappeared a bit, because Shoop was just so good against it, and Shoop also is a Squirtle deck, which is probably the only one you kind of want to bring.
Yeah, and I think that's in my opinion. This is going to seem weird, but in my opinion, Shoop Squirtle has driven the meta cycle that we've seen in tournaments over the last couple shifts, because I think there's almost like a rock paper scissors set of lineups out there for Conquest right now, and we've sort of gone almost through that entire phase, I think, on pro ladder and in tournaments over the last 3 months or so. So at Red Dragon and Wild Hunt, we sort of started off in what I'd call a tall meta. Great Swords has always been very strong, but also in those tournaments, hand buff for Nilfgaard did really, really well, and so did Consume to a certain extent for people who brought it. Along with some other 4th deck that it was. And that generally worked. That's sort of the lineup that I brought, except I brought Dagon over Consume. And then what we saw sort of in the next month or so after that, particularly in Pro Ladder, is that some decks like Shoop Scoia'tael can be teched pretty well against, particularly in Ithna version, against both hand buff Nilfgaard and Consume to a certain extent. And so at the top of Pro Ladder, we started to see those decks being forced out because everyone brought Shoop because it was the only viable Scoia'tael deck, and it sort of pushed the meta away from hand buff in particular and sort of away from Consume to a certain extent. And then about a month ago, I think that started changing again because everyone knew that Shoop would get brought. And so people started to say what decks are pretty decent against Shoop. There was that oftentimes it's sort of linear point spam decks that can just out point spam Shoop. Sometimes things like Foltest on Red Coin or Veterans with a bit of carryover as well can start to do really well against the Shoop Scoia'tael matchup. And so we started to see a bit more of a linear meta, sort of the third step in the evolution. Until recently, in my opinion, what's likely to be good now, well, if all of your opponents are playing Foltest and Vets, then I think there's actually a case to start going back to things like hand buff and Consume again, because those very tall decks are often things that the linear decks can't answer. So it all sort of goes around and around in a cycle. It'll be really interesting to see what people bring in to the upcoming challenger as to where they think their opponents will be on that cycle and how they want to try to counter that.
Yeah, what
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go on.
And I was going to say, I actually literally just looked at Dogma's comment, and hopefully I ended up saying almost exactly what Dogma said there in the chat.
Yeah.
Great comment.
One thing to note that's also interesting is that if you have different stages of a tournament, like in the qualifier, when in Swiss there was Santo brought out a greedy lineup in Swiss and just rolled through it, and then after that, I think Ithran brought a how do you call it? Just the lineup you said with Foltest and Vets, just anti-control. So both kind of work well in the same tournament. Very interesting because they kind of like on different stages of the meta cycle.
Exactly, absolutely. And so yeah, with that, we'll take any other questions here, and then we'll go to our case study, building our lineup. I think that
I have a question. I didn't heard everything, so I don't know if I'm repeating something. But let's assume we would have a tournament after homecoming, and everything changed. How can you prepare really fast for something new where you don't know exactly what's the meta?
That's a great question. So here's my answer to it. So right now we're in a very information-rich meta. Right, the meta's been stable for a while. We've seen meta snapshots and meta reports and lots of tournaments with some of the same decks. And so in an information-heavy meta, pretty much everyone has access to most of the information. A totally disrupted meta, right? A totally new game, all new decks. You're in a very information-poor meta where nobody really knows what's going on so far. And so in my eyes, the best way to do it is to find all of the, it's whoever has most information has the edge, which basically says, whoever has access to, day-to-day advanced Gwent up stats or teams with lots of competitive players testing things out. At that point, there's a lot of unoptimized decks, and basically the more resources that you just have to find the better decks, that becomes more important than trying to predict particular matchups.
Yeah, I totally agree here.
So the only...
Okay, so you talk first.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to say the only problem going to be that probably after homecoming, I don't know if you're going to have Gwent up or anything like this. Maybe even the the Gwent DB side is going to change because probably the deck building going to be different. So it's probably a pretty weird question, but what you're going to do in such a complicated situation if you don't have Gwent DB? You probably only can watch at Gwent Reddit where someone writes, "Yeah, look, boys, this deck is really good and OP." What are you doing exactly?
The thing about new metas is always, I think Patrick Hoban is basically the best Yu-Gi-Oh player of all time. He said that the earlier in the meta, the more skill rewarding it is for deck building because if you have a good feeling of the game, if you understand the game very well, you will find the broken stuff earlier than other people that have to rely on what have other people done and how's the matchup data there. If you can see what decks can do well, what decks have just more points than the others, that's a huge advantage, and you don't need data for that. Data is of course, very useful still, and you need it, but just having this understanding of the game is very helpful in that regard.
There's always, over the course of a meta cycle, there's always the very beginning where there's a lot of deck creativity and new things being built, and then eventually you get to the information-rich and more optimization phase, where a lot of the most of the big concepts are known, and it's sort of tweaking things around the edges. And it's fair to say that we're in that phase now. That's not to say that there's no new decks. I mean, Swim is pushing up towards #1 ranked with the deck that I think, to be honest, I'm not sure how viable of a ladder deck it is, again, at a really, really high level, but I am pretty sure that the deck would be reasonably strong as a red deck in a tournament. His new buffing, Nova and Olaf and Adrenaline Rush deck.
It's nothing new. It's weird. He didn't have anything to do, so he built this weird stuff. So okay, thank you. It's in the end, it's something about being really good and understanding the game fast. But yeah, we have to see. Homecoming launch going to be really interesting. Okay, second question: who's your favorite Team Aretuza member?
who's
you don't have to answer this.
He's right here in the
That means you have two options then: the guy who asked the question or the guy who we directed the question to. But yeah, fair enough. You don't have to specify which one it is, and no one's feelings get hurt. All right, so let's go on to our case study then.
Good.
Yeah, all right. So is everyone here familiar with the rules of the upcoming Lodge tournament? If not, then just say something or something in voice chat. All right. So the rules are best of 3, and you are locked into a faction. So all of your decks have to be that one faction. There's no ban, as far as I know, and you have to play all 3 decks, and then just a bad record wins. Then it's separated in Swiss, and after that, top 8. And the Swiss cutoff is the best person from each faction, and then the next best 3 records. And yeah, so what's important here is, because it's not standard ruling, and these kinds of tournament, you want to understand the rules and maybe find a way to exploit it. For example, you will know that there will be a lot of Skellige and Gnurrgard. So that's something we have to note for later. And also for, as I said, the best person from each faction will automatically go to Swiss. So even if you're not having the best, like a top 8 record, but if you're playing something like Monstrous or Scoia'tael that not everyone will play, then you have a higher chance to get into top 8, even with a worse record than someone who played Skellige or Gnurrgard. All right. Yeah, so we're going to go over to step 2.
So let's go ahead and try something a little bit fun and unusual for our theme for this one. Well, clearly part of our theme is picking a faction, right? This is a bit of an unusual tournament. And what we're going to do, lots of people are going to play Northern Realms and Nilfgaard and Skellige. So we're going to pick Scoia'tael today. That's the faction that we're going to pick. And so the first thing we need to ask ourselves is, actually have to choose from. So I'm going to keep a running list of decks here, and I want your guys' help in the chat to try and see if there's any decks I've forgotten. All right, so I'm going to start listing decks here and pitch in if you think I've forgotten anything. So we can pick some kind of shoot deck. That's probably likely to happen for Scoia'tael. There is Spellitel as well. That's a known one. Usually with Aithna there. I mean, pretty much only with Aithna. Although I guess you could use Philavandrel. We could run a dwarves list, maybe even with Pavko. That's often a Brewer Aithna thing. There's a couple different swap variants. There's a swap variant with Brewer and Aithna that maybe has Barclay abuse with Cleaver plus a whole bunch of swapping elves. There's sort of the old school Francesca swapping, maybe with even Elias. There is a list that Sir Pumpkin ran with some ambush units that then swaps out a bunch of sappers, 11 strength sappers to get 16 strength swappy horses, as I call them. What else could there be? Hand buff. We talked about Squirtle hand buff earlier as an option. And then even if we think way back, we could even maybe try to put together some kind of golden weather or movement Squirtle type archetype, even though that hasn't really been seen much in the meta. All right, so we got to pick 3 of those different archetypes, and then we've got to match them with leaders, right? And we've only got 4 options for leaders. Our leaders are Brewer and Aithna, who I'm pretty sure we're going to use, and then Francesca and Philavandrel, who I really wish we wouldn't have to use, but we'll have to use one of them, unfortunately. So the question, let's start our building process the following way: best Francesca or Philavandrel deck that we think we can build. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? All right, well, I'll start with one. Let's say it this way. So I want to try to protect that deck a little bit. So I think I'm going to try to build a red deck off of that. So whatever deck we build with Philavandrel and Francesca, I'm going to build it on red. And looking at our archetypes, a lot of the archetypes we have are stuck with only one leader. Like, for example, Spelltel is probably Aithna, unless we want to try to use Philavandrel. Dwarfs is probably going to be Brewer or Aithna. So my proposal for our first deck is that we actually try a Francesca Shoop deck. Let's start there. And Francesca can tutor Shoop. I mean, it sort of wastes the points on it. Francesca is super low tempo, but we can play her on red, right? And so the other thing that we might be able to do there is we might be able to actually drop the spy, right? Because one of the main reasons to run Yavin as the spy in Squirtle is because he can tutor Shoop. But if we already have Francesca to guarantee tutor Shoop as a red deck, then maybe we can actually get away without a spy if we're super careful about it. And that way we can also play other specials too, because we don't need to limit our specials in order to find Shoop off Yavin. All right, so that's deck number 1. Let's just try this for fun. Francesca Shoop, and see where we go from there. After that, we have to pick some Brewer and Aithna lists. And we've got a couple options, but one that I'm partial to is to play along with a dwarfs list. Some of you guys who know me know that I was playing around with dwarfs, and I think they're a pretty decent point spam deck. And so we need to figure out how to use it. And I think what I'll try to do with that is I'll make it Brewer dwarfs to start. Let's just see where we end up with the lineup. Brewer dwarfs, and put that down as the second one, because then we have a couple options with Aithna. We can take maybe a Spelltel list, or we could take maybe a swapping list potentially. But I've seen Spelltel get played we're looking for relatively strong decks, and I've seen Spelltel get played to over 1400 pro ladder MMR. And in particular, maybe it's good against things that we might expect, even like great swords, let's say. If you can put some countering tools in there, or maybe consume, maybe it'd be good there. So let's take that as our third list, right? And so, well, what's our theme here, right? Obviously, we're sort of faction locked for our theme, and we have to play all 3 leaders, so that takes away a lot of our flexibility. It's hard to try and counter, all of Skellige, for instance, given what we have. So my plan here is that after we get faction locked, I'm just going to play the best decks that I can come up with. we need to only do three different archetypes and 3 different leaders. So we're taking sort of a good stuff approach, even though, to be very honest, looking at the stuff we have, I'm not sure how good it is. But that's what we got. You know, we're going to take advantage of the fact that we don't necessarily have to be in the top 8. We just have to be the best Scoia'tael player to make it through to the bracket rounds. So that's my plan, Gnurrgard. What do you think? I'm gonna let you go to the next stage, which is to review and revise our lineup. How did I screw up here? What do you think?
Yes. So looking at the lineup, you said you're not going to Spy and Shoop, and then you're not going to play Spy and Spelltell either because most of the Spelltell lists don't have slots for them. That leaves Bruva with the only deck that, like Dwarfs, the only deck that you can play on blue. Are you really confident in that? Like playing Dwarfs on blue? You don't have Wardens anymore.
That's a really good point. Maybe we have to. We don't have any blue decks there, right? Because when I played Bruver Dwarfs, I played Ithna Dwarfs on ladder and got to about 1350 with it. That's a deck that I played without Spy as well, actually. So yeah, you're right. It looks like we actually have all 3 red decks, and it looks like Wilson's found that in chat too. So we need to come up with an idea. So I don't know. Do you have any ideas to see if we can rearrange things and try to get ourselves better on blue?
Yeah, so what Wilson suggested here is bringing a swap deck that can dry pass. So I like bringing a deck that can dry pass because, as I said, we don't have Wardens anymore. So dry passing is probably our way with dealing with blue coin in Scoia'tael. So I don't know how good swap Scoia'tael is on blue, because what leader would we use?
I think it might be decent. I think it might be decent. I mean, we could use probably either. It depends what we want to drop. I think what we could do, we could play Ithna with either Dwarfs or Spelltell,
Yep.
in my opinion. And so we could sort of play it with swap. So I think we could probably drop either Dwarfs or Spelltell to get our other blue deck. And so swapping is definitely one way to do it there. So what's the best swapping leader right now? Does anyone know? I haven't played swap in a long time. Is it actually Bruver or is it Ithna?
There are different swap lists, right? There's as we said, there's this pumpkin list, and then there's just classic, the old Cleaver deck that doesn't have Wardens anymore. So both of these lists would use Bruva. So you would have to switch Bruva over to that deck, and either we keep Spelltell or we move Ithna to Dwarfs. I don't want to kick Shoop. Shoop is too good to kick.
Yeah, so we have to run Shoop at some point, right? And we're pairing what's probably our strongest archetype, Shoop, to try and prop up our weakest leader, Francesca. So I think that stays. So yeah, I like it. So here's one of our options then. So we've got I'll type it out. We've got Fran Shoop, Bruver, and Ithna, Dwarfs or Spelltell. I like it. All right, so that's one option.
So,
can you think of any other options for putting together a blue deck?
First of all, for the swap outs, we'd have to decide what version we want to go with, and I think the just old school Cleaver thing is the best because you have a high tempo opener, and then you have good long run value, which is kind of like the blue coin trademarks. If you want to dry pass, you want to be able to have a good long run because if your opponent bleeds you want to have one card up, and then you also have Cleaver for the high tempo opener. So another thing that might be a little bit more experimental, but we're just trying to have fun here, is we could try to use Bruva and build a movement Scoia'tael list, especially because movement Scoia'tael always operates with Golden Weather, and Golden Weather is actually pretty good against Gnurrgard, so we would have a good matchup against Gnurrgard lineups with that deck. So the good thing here is that the movement deck works really well with Bruva. So what you can do is play Bruva with the high tempo opener that Pumpkin uses in swap deck. You play Bruva, Barclay, and what's the guy called that throws all the units away in one row?
What is that, Skags?
Yeah, Sheldon Skags. And he works really well with the Blue Mountain Commander. The thing here is you can't do this opener with Barclay, so you're missing 5 points, which is pretty sad, because you want to use the movement dwarfs to. The movement dwarfs are also the reason why you can't just run Cleaver in this deck for a high tempo opener. But I think the points are still pretty good if you play Blue Mountains and Sheldon Skaggs into one row of Brewer.
I think it gives us some options here, right? So we've got a couple potential lists, right? And now it's possible that we can take it to practice, right? We can practice in a very concentrated and specific way, right? So the first thing we can ask is, you mentioned that the Golden Weather deck might be good against the Nilfgaard lineup, because oftentimes Nilfgaard doesn't necessarily, particularly Alchemy, doesn't necessarily run Weatherclear, right? So we have to, and also I think they'll probably be playing Alchemy on red for Nilfgaard, so that might be a nice way to snipe it. So we've got a test, right? We've got a couple different options here for Aithna, dwarfs or Spellitel, and a couple different options for Brewer, elves versus Golden Weather. So we can, if we think we want to try to beat Nilfgaard, we can ask our practice partner to play a couple series like that. Are these lists, which one's better for the particular purpose? And we may have to decide, if we really think that we can play, Swampy Elves is a good enough blue deck, or if Golden Weather is a total meme. But now at least we've got some ideas, right? We've got a couple potential lineups. We've been able to refine it down to a basic theme and address some of our obvious weaknesses, like the fact that we didn't have a single blue coin deck. And now we can do focused practice, right? We can really get the most out of it, as opposed to having very experimental practice. So yeah, it seems like we've got something. I'm not sure if this lineup's about to win us the tournament. I don't know, maybe if we gave it to Tailbot, he could. But at the very least, hopefully it should give us a good shot at trying to make top 8 by being the best Scoia'tael player in the tournament. I don't know, what do you guys think? How would you go about it, or do you have any suggestions that we should take in mind with our kind of Mimi Scoia'tael set we've put together? All right, they think we're geniuses. They have no criticism whatsoever. It's the best set of lists they've ever put together. Fran Shoop coming to a tournament near you.
Slots open for the tournament. I'm just queuing this lineup.
Fair enough. Yeah, is anyone actually here signed up to play Scoia'tael in the Lodge tournament? If you go ahead and take our lineup here, I promise to. Oh, is literally. There we go. We've got one. We've actually been doing the prep for. We've actually been doing the prep for Wilson. I like it. Excellent. All right. Well then, there we go. Hopefully we've moved him along the road a little bit, and hopefully we'll see some of these Scoia'tael decks and the tournament coming up in a couple of weeks. Unfortunately, I wish I could play the Lodge tournament, but I'll be traveling on that day, which is sad. Maybe the next time. It's a really fascinating concept, and to be honest, I really love tournaments like that throw an alternative rule set. So, all right. In any case,
now with Homecoming coming up soon, and we, as you said, we already did all the steps of the tournament. Having a different rule set kind of spices things up, makes it a bit more interesting, and people who play the tournament actually have to figure stuff out instead of mostly knowing what the tournament meta is all about.
Absolutely. Well, good. All right, so let's open it up to any last questions or things that you would like to discuss. Otherwise, it looks like we've reached pretty much the end of our workshop today, just about an hour in. So anything else? I'll leave the chat open for about 30 seconds, and then we'll call it a day. Wilson says, why is bringing Abaya to a tournament a good idea? And the answer is, if you're lucky enough to think Abaya is a terrible card, but have your friend convince you to bring it anyways, then who knows? It may win you $1,000, and then you'll be eternally grateful to that person. So, under the same token, I recommend everyone bring Francesca Shoop to your next tournament, and when you win $1,000, I will, take 10% of it as a finder's fee. Good luck, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Questions, or is that it? The thing is, I don't know if Cooper actually wants to do something or just wants to meme here. Mostly it's like 90% memeing.
Memeing.
Should
Yeah,
everyone
definitely.
should everyone play a single silver Lambert? I recommend it for all of my opponents and none of my friends. And with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate it. It's been great to talk through tournaments a little bit with you. If you have any questions for either of the presenters today, please feel free to contact us on Discord, and best of luck in your upcoming play.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.